Today, I'm going to teach you the worst bishop's opening according to classical theory, which mysteriously gave me plus 500 rating points and should be illegal because of how much it destroys our opponent's preparation. So yeah, no messing around, I'm Philip, let's jump right in. So what you're usually used to seeing is that after e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, and then you see bishop to c4, right? The most common response is knight to f6. The idea is to get your opponent thinking they're playing an Italian to pull them out of preparation. And the idea here is for you to play pawn to d3. And then we get the modern bishop's opening, which leads to much more closed positions with a positional style of play. Lots of maneuvering with some really interesting positions. So after pawn to d3, we defend our central pawn and we close the chain after already having our bishop on c4. The common continuation here in modern bishop's opening theory is that black plays their bishop to e7 now, developing in a slightly more passive way as well, because after that, they want to play d6 and close the pawn chain, and the bishop ends up stuck inside here. There's also an alternative line after d3 where black can go h6, slowing down that bishop's development a bit with the idea of stopping the pin with bishop to g5 or any knight to g5 ideas that white would have attacking f7. So since that is an alternative line, let's look at it quickly, and then we go back to the main line with bishop to e7 in that position. So after pawn to h6, white can just continue normally with castling. The opponent goes d6, like I said, closing the chain and leaving the bishop inside it. And then you play c3 to set up a central push with d4 and g6. This is the weirdest idea in the Italian game, and it's not something you see very often, which is fianchettoing the bishop. So that's why black closes this chain, because they're not planning to develop the bishop along that diagonal. They're going to put the bishop on g7, which is why they play g6 first. So this is an idea you really need to know if you want to play this line with h6. And here, white can already start contesting the center with d4, because at this point we're already comfortably developed, we've prepared these pawn breaks properly, and we've already castled. What we want is to open up the center as fast as possible, maybe bring a rook over to e1, and try to get some kind of attack going as early as we realistically can, right? Now, the very first thing you're probably wondering is whether this push actually hangs the pawn on e4, like if black can just take on e4 here and walk away up a pawn. Technically, black can take, but this line really doesn't hold up because we get pawn takes, and then bishop to d5, hitting both knights at the same time. And the whole idea for us is we're going to chase that knight out of the e-file and then play rook e1 so the knight on f3 and the rook on e1 can work together to put serious pressure on the pawn on e5. And that's how we end up winning back the pawn black picked up on e4. And we do it with a clear advantage. So black goes bishop to f5, trying to hold the knight instead of moving it. And now we play rook e1, putting more pressure on that knight, and the opponent can't really add any more defense, so they're forced to move it. And once the knight moves, you play bishop takes c6 with check, taking out the knight that was defending the pawn on e5. Pawn takes c6, and then we trade queens, and finally, knight takes e5, getting the pawn back. And even after that capture, we still have the threat of a discovered check, and if the opponent does nothing, we win the rook on h8. That's why black has to play bishop to e6, closing the e-file and stopping the discovered check. And now we can actually take on c6 and end up a pawn. Then comes rook to d6, attacking the knight, and we retreat to e4. That's why after we play pawn to d4, it's not good for black to take on e4 because at the end of the line, white is the one who comes out a pawn up. The best continuation is for black to play queen to e7, trying to consolidate the position first and only then threaten knight takes e4. And we follow up with rook to e1, defending the pawn. They keep going with bishop to g7, sticking to the plan of playing pawn to g6 to set up the bishop fianchetto. We go knight to d2, just developing normally with that pretty standard idea from Italian game theory, where you want to maneuver the knight to f1 and then to e3, or maybe g3, where it's going to have an eye on f5. And on top of that is just better placed on the king side. Black can keep going by castling to get the king out of the center, and then comes pawn to h3, stopping any knight to g4 ideas, or even bishop to g4. And we reach this position that's kinda closed. We've got more space in the center, we've got a bit more piece activity, and because of that, white is slightly better in this position. And that's basically how the game can play out when the opponent chooses to go with pawn to h6, and it also helps you know what to do when you're playing against it, right? Let's go back to the main line, which is after d3 defending the pawn, black plays bishop to e7, developing his piece in a slightly calmer way. So what we're going to see here are some of the main ideas for both sides, where each piece usually gets developed, what some common maneuvers are, some common pawn breaks, and this is going to help us get a clearer idea of how to play this type of position from both sides. So after bishop to e7, we can go ahead and castle here. It's easily the most intuitive move you could imagine in this position, and black is going to castle as well. Everything just feels very natural. Now rook to e1, and then d6 comes in, defending the pawn on e5, and at the same time, opening up space to develop the light-squared bishop. And from here, the main line keeps going with a4, because in the Italian, it's extremely common for black to play his knight to a5, where that knight directly goes after the bishop on c4, and the bishop really can't retreat. I mean, the bishop could technically drop back to b3, but then the knight just takes it, and black ends up better trading his knight for that bishop, which is easily the best piece white has. So this move a4 comes with the idea of fighting for a bit more space on the queen side, and if black does go knight to a5, we have the a2 square available to retreat the bishop and keep it safe along that diagonal. So that's the whole point behind this move. Another move you might have thought about in this position here is, why not play c3, getting ready for the push with d4, which is another extremely thematic idea in this type of position. Well, you can play c3 here, but then black gets the chance to go knight to a5, attacking the bishop. And like I said earlier, if the bishop goes back to b3, it just gets taken and black trades his knight for our bishop, which is the best piece we have. So the best option we have is to play bishop to b5, where if black wants to kick this bishop out, he's gonna have to spend a few tempi playing, for example, a6, bishop back to a4, and b5, hitting the bishop again, and now we can bring the bishop back to c2, repositioning it along this new diagonal here, where it's eventually going to be targeting the weakness on h7 and staying out of the reach of that knight on a5, which is now even more passive by being stuck in the corner. So after rook to e1 and d6, like I said, a4 is the most common move that keeps the ideas in this opening we're specifically looking at. And here, black normally continues with knight to a5. That was exactly the idea, to go after the bishop. Now we drop the bishop back to a2, since we do have the a2 square for it. Then comes c5, contesting the center, trying as much as possible to shut down these d4 ideas white has. We play c3 on our side, getting ready for the d4 push, and that way opening up the position later on once our pieces are better developed. The knight goes back to c6. So black's idea was to move the knight here from c6 to a5 with tempo, force white to retreat the bishop, and then get the time he needs to push the c-pawn. And after that, bring the knight back with the pawn pushed up, which is an improvement in the position, because after the knight comes back to c6 here, now the pawn and the knight work together to control important squares on our side of the board. And here, what has the idea of knight to a3, it's also very common in this type of Italian opening position to play the knight to b2 and then try to maneuver it that way, like I mentioned. But in this opening, the move knight to a3 is more common because it keeps the d2 square available for the bishop. And then with the knight on a3, we can look for a similar maneuver, like for example, knight to c4 and then to e3, where it's already going to be controlling important squares here in the center. And after that, if we want to continue with this maneuver, we can even bring it back to f1 and to g3. As you can see, this opening is very positional, full of maneuvers. Leave a comment down below letting me know what you think about this opening so I can bring more videos like this in future videos. Well, then the game could continue with h6, cutting off the idea of us putting any piece on g5. We continue with bishop to d2, developing the piece since the knight doesn't occupy that square anymore and is instead on a3. Then comes a6, cutting off ideas white might have had of putting the knight on b5. Then h3 on our side. So both sides keep making these small pawn moves on the flanks to slow down the opponent's play, get a bit more control over space, and limit the opponent's options. And here, we've reached a position that has a lot of ideas. Like I said, this is a game that's going to be rich in maneuvers and positional ideas. There isn't much tactics going on here. It's a very closed position. So this is an opening that's suitable for players who enjoy this type of game. What really stands out here are the plans that are common for both sides. So what are the ideas for the black player? That bishop on c8 usually gets developed to e6, where it's going to contest that diagonal and challenge white's bishop on a2, which is a great piece. If after you play bishop to e6, white takes, you can recapture with the f-pawn, improve your control over the d5 and f5 squares, and you're also going to have the f-file for your rook to use, plus ideas of attacking on the king side. That's one of the ideas. The other one is to move the a rook to b8 and get ready for a b5 push where the goal is to trade the b pawn for the b pawn, then open up the file for your rook and get a lot of activity along that file. Now, some of the common ideas for white are being able to play b4 because since c3 has already been played, the goal is to challenge that pawn on c5, which is going to weaken black's control over the d4 square a bit. And then down the line, you have ideas of breaking with d4 and opening the position up a little more and making that rook on e1 more active. The other idea is to play knight to c4, where it's going to maneuver later to e3, control those important central squares, and be in slightly more flexible position. Because from e3, you can even maneuver to f1 and to g3 and get ready for an attack on the king side. And one idea for the knight on f3 is to move it to h2 and to g4 and try to put pressure on that knight on f6, which is the main defender of black's kingside position. Still, when it comes to white's plans, you can also have ideas of sacrificing the bishop from d2 on h6. For example, you can play bishop to e3 and queen to d2 and build up this pressure along that diagonal and try to sack the bishop on h6 for 2 pawns. And then the queen is going to invade the position. So mixing these ideas together is also pretty interesting. Just to show a few more moves, the position could continue with rook to b8, for example, knight to c4, bishop to e6, and b4. All of these plans here are what you see most often at a high level of chess. So I hope this video has helped you get a better feel for this type of position and also pick up some positional and maneuvering ideas to use in your own games. And if you want to see another video on the bishop's opening, click on the video that's showing up on the screen right now. I'm going to show you the specific 9-move line that I use in the bishop's opening, a sequence that punishes the most common mistakes opponents rake and puts you in a winning position before the middle game even starts. Click now. You don't need any preparation at all, because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.